The little boy casually placed a marble on the ground, yet he watched it roll away on its own. Witnessing this eerie scene, the father immediately realized a terrifying fact. This building was severely tilting. The family had just moved in happily yesterday. Thinking about how he had exhausted his family's savings of 11 years for this apartment, only to end up with such a defective unit, the father's heart sank to rock bottom. The next day at work, Dongwon's doubts lingered. He started searching for information about the building on his computer, and the online discussions chilled him to the bone. It turned out he wasn't the only one who noticed the tilting. Angry homeowners even bluntly called the building a shoddy construction project. After work, Dongwon decided to verify his judgment again. He went to the window and tried to push it, checking if it was stuck due to deformation, but found the window opened and closed smoothly without any issues. He placed the marble on the ground again, but this time the ball stayed quietly in place with no sign of movement. Dongwon breathed a sigh of relief, thinking his worries might have been unnecessary. However, the breathing of a building is far more complex than people imagine. As night fell, a sudden torrential rain poured down on Seoul, and rainwater began to seep in through tiny cracks in the exterior walls. The cracks on the outside of the apartment were quietly expanding. A fissure starting from the third floor extended upward and downward like lightning, with every expansion accompanied by a slight cracking sound. But under the noise of the heavy rain, this danger signal was completely ignored. Meanwhile, the glass of the main entrance shattered due to the sudden increase in pressure, as if foreshadowing a greater danger to come. Early the next morning, Man Soo, who lived there, was the first to notice something wrong. He found that the lobby glass had cracked, and with just a light touch, the entire pane instantly shattered into pieces. As Dongwon prepared to go downstairs to work, he saw new cracks spreading on the ground in the parking lot, and his uneasiness deepened. He immediately called the government department to report the situation, hoping they would send someone to inspect and repair it as soon as possible. But the reply came quickly. The repair process could only be started with the consent of all owners. However, most owners were worried that once the outside world knew about the quality issues of the apartment, property prices would plummet. Eventually, the matter was suppressed, and the cracks continued to expand in silence. 2 days later, Dongwon decided to host a housewarming party and invited his colleagues over to celebrate. That night, glasses clinked in the new house. The atmosphere was lively, and alcohol made people forget their troubles and paralyzed their alertness to danger. As the late-night party came to an end, everyone was dead drunk. Considering they all had to work the next day, Dongwon suggested they stay overnight, as the living room sofa and empty room were enough to accommodate everyone. These seemingly thoughtful arrangements inadvertently placed more lives in danger. Early the next morning, Dongwon's wife, Young Yi, came back from shopping and found Dongwon in a deep, drunken sleep, unable to be reached by phone. She had to ask her son, Suchan, to go home and fetch a handcart. At the same time, the hungover Sung-hyun suddenly remembered he had a friend's wedding to attend. Fighting a headache, he got up, rushed downstairs, and hailed a taxi at the entrance. Just as Sung-hyun sat into the car, the entire building let out a low and terrifying roar, as if it were a growl from the depths of the earth. The ground shook violently, and the cement road on the street cracked instantly. The cracks spread wildly like a gaping giant mouth. Man Soo waved desperately from the rooftop, screaming at the old man watering flowers on the opposite building to call the police immediately. However, before his shouts could fully fade, an even more terrifying scene occurred. The entire building began to lose support and started to fall vertically. The taxi Sung-hyun was in was also swept into it. That modern residential building, which had stood tall, vanished into dust and smoke within a dozen seconds, as if it had never existed. During the fall, the building suddenly got stuck, huddled in the dark abyss hundreds of meters underground. The massive structure tilted, making creaking sounds like the carcass of a giant beast ready to snap at any moment. Dongwon mistakenly thought the danger had passed, but when he stumbled to the door, the scene before him left him completely dumbfounded. The familiar street was gone, replaced by a bottomless black abyss. Just as he stood there in shock, something even more horrifying happened. The building, suspended in midair, lost its final support and fell again. In this violent compression, the taxi Sung-hyun was in was forcibly pushed from the first floor to the roof, eventually ending up in Dongwon's fifth-floor living room. In the nick of time, Dongwon used all his strength to pull Sung-hyun out of the taxi. Dongwon had just caught his breath when he suddenly heard a shrill cry for help. His heart tightened, and his first reaction was that something happened to his wife. He rushed toward the sound without thinking, but when he found the person, he discovered it wasn't his wife, but his female colleague, Yoon Ju, who had stayed overnight. Dongwon searched the entire area, but found no trace of his wife and son. He realized they might not be in the building and perhaps had gone out. On the ground, the rescue teams arrived quickly, yet the situation before them was beyond everyone's expectations. This was no ordinary building collapse, but a rare large-scale ground subsidence disaster. Several rescue members attached ropes and tried to descend along the pit walls to rescue those deep down. However, the soil around the sinkhole kept collapsing, and falling rocks and sand threatened to bury or cut the ropes at any moment. Forced by circumstances, they had to abandon this dangerous plan. Subsequently, they switched to another plan, operating a drone to explore the bottom of the pit. The machine descended slowly, but just as the drone reached halfway, the signal was suddenly interrupted, and the footage came to an abrupt halt. Mansu's son, Seung Tai, displayed calmness and survival skills far beyond his years. He told the other survivors that according to knowledge he learned online, they might now be hundreds of meters underground. They needed to assess the situation quickly, find food and water sources, establish a temporary shelter, and find a way to contact the outside world for help. Mansu felt fortunate about his son's internet usage for the first time. It turned out his son wasn't learning games, but truly useful survival skills. Dongwon was filled with guilt, blaming himself for inviting everyone to the party, as now everyone was trapped in this hellish deep pit. Seong-hyun was depressed. He never thought he would lose his life at an old friend's house. This ironic ending made him feel utter despair. Dongwon refused to accept the idea of death. He emphasized that he had struggled for a full 11 years to buy this house, only to encounter this disaster after living in it for just 2 weeks. This injustice filled his heart with unwillingness to give up. He insisted on surviving and would not allow those around him to give up hope. Seong-hyun admitted he couldn't control his fear. Scenes of death kept flashing in his mind, making it hard for him to shake off the despair. Yoonju tried to divert Seong-hyun's attention by reminding him to think about Hyo-jung, the co-worker he had always had a crush on. Seong-hyun laughed bitterly, feeling that liking her wouldn't change anything. Hyo-jung was already dating the department manager, while he was just someone living in a rented room. Dongwon encouraged Seong-hyun not to give up easily. They weren't engaged yet, and he could totally confess his feelings after they escaped. Seong-hyun became even more frustrated, noting that the manager had already bought an apartment while he had no capital to compete, especially since that apartment had appreciated by 200 million won. This blow completely crushed Seong-hyun, and he broke down, feeling he really didn't want to live anymore. Yoon-ju spoke up to break the deadlock, saying she also lived in a single room. Did people living in single rooms have no right to get married? A single room could become a 2-room apartment, and 2 rooms could become 3. Dongwon nodded repeatedly in agreement, using his own experience as an example. He also lived in a single room initially, and hasn't he now switched to a 3-room home?
10명 걸으셨다면서요, 10명. 그것을 지금 이게...
But Seong-hyun stopped halfway through his sentence, and the air suddenly froze. The atmosphere became extremely awkward. The news outside began reporting the accident. At 10:50 a.m., a sinkhole collapse occurred in Jiangsu-dong, Seoul. An entire building fell in, caused by foundation subsidence. More than 30 people suffered minor injuries and 7 were seriously injured, all sent to major hospitals. The families on the surface were most worried that the people down below had nothing to eat. To cheer everyone up, Mansu showed off his cooking skills and made a roast chicken amidst the predicament. Just as a brief warmth ignited, the building suddenly sank again, and Seong-hyun was thrown out instantly because he wasn't standing firmly. In panic, he clung tightly to the edge. When the shaking subsided, a giant rock fell from the sky. Yoon-ju, her limbs in the air, narrowly dodged it and immediately threw a cable to Seong-hyun's side. Everyone worked together and pulled desperately, finally dragging Seong-hyun up. But an accident happened again. The cable suddenly snapped, and Mansu, caught off guard, grabbed at empty air and fell into the depths of the sinkhole. Sung-tae, desperate to save his father, jumped down without hesitation. At the critical moment, the others rushed downstairs, smashed the glass, and pulled the father and son back from the brink of death. Meanwhile, the drone that had fallen earlier suddenly regained its signal, slowly rose to the sky, and flew back to the ground. The rescue team immediately retrieved the footage, and figures of the trapped people appeared on the screen, finally confirming that the people in the building were still alive. However, the mother on the second floor and Young-yi never saw their children's figures, and they broke down on the spot. The rescue team on the surface temporarily secured the building next to the sinkhole with ropes, but the risk of collapse remained extremely high, and a crisis hung over their heads. Worse still, the weather forecast showed that a torrential rainstorm was coming at night, which would be nothing short of another disaster for them. Rescuers emphasized that if the Jiangsu residential building was also pulled in and collapsed, The consequences would be unimaginable. Someone proposed that the reinforced concrete pillars below must be blasted by engineering means to shift the center of gravity away from the sinkhole to prevent the entire building complex from being dragged into the abyss. But as soon as this plan was proposed, it triggered fierce opposition from the residents. They were worried that their perfectly fine houses would be intentionally destroyed. They asked, "Are we only caring about saving the survivors in the sinkhole while ignoring the people living on the surface?" Residents argued endlessly. Some insisted on not agreeing to the pillar demolition plan, believing the house would be completely ruined, and the situation reached a stalemate. Just then, a resident spoke slowly. He mentioned that there was still someone trapped on the roof of the dangerous building. In the moment he made eye contact with that person, he was deeply shaken, feeling as if he would face divine retribution if he continued to object. These words made the air suddenly silent. Finally, he gritted his teeth and stated that he was willing to agree to the rescue plan. The mood of the crowd was gradually swayed, and the wavering attitudes slowly began to loosen. At the same time, the rescue team was urgently preparing supply drops. Satellite phones and emergency items were strapped to parachutes. They had to be sent down as soon as possible before the rainstorm arrived. With a command, the parachutes slowly opened, and the supplies landed steadily in the depths of the ruins. After everyone got the supplies, Sung-hyun couldn't wait to make a call. Soon after, the satellite phone connected to the rescue center on the ground. The survivors began to report the situation, confirming there were 15 survivors. Although some were injured, they were generally safe. However, some worrying news also came through the phone. Dongwon learned from his wife that their son, Soo-chan, was also trapped downstairs when he went home to get the handcart and was very likely trapped in the underground parking lot. This news made Dongwon's heart sink violently. He had thought his son had already left with his wife, but now he found that the child might also be in the same dangerous situation. The heavy rain arrived as expected. Rainwater poured madly underground along the cracks of the sinkhole. The accumulated water rose at a visible speed, quickly submerging the bottom layer of the ruins. In this crisis, Dongwon decided to risk going down the elevator shaft to find Soo-chan. The building next to the sinkhole could no longer hold on. The ropes snapped one after another, and the entire building crashed down, plunging headfirst into the sinkhole, fortunately getting stuck halfway and stopping. Soo-chan, waiting for rescue in the car, suddenly saw a light. Sung-hoon, the boy from the second floor, was holding a candle, its weak flame flickering in the darkness. Sung-hoon seemed to be guiding Soo-chan, signaling him to leave the car and move to a safe place. Soo-chan summoned his courage, pushed open the car door, and walked out carefully. The very next second after he left the car, a huge concrete block fell from the sky, smashing the car that had been protecting him into pieces. If he had left a step later, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Dongwon groped his way along the pipes and finally found Soo-chan in the dark. Soo-chan cried and threw himself into his father's arms, his first words asking about Sung-hoon's whereabouts. Dongwon's heart tightened, and he turned to look for him, only to unexpectedly spot an elderly woman who had also survived on an upper floor. He hurriedly asked if she had seen a boy named Sung-hoon. The grandmother was silent for a moment, then slowly raised her hand and pointed to a tent nearby. Dongwon was shocked to realize that Sung-hoon had already died in the collapse. This discovery shocked him deeply. Perhaps the faint candlelight and the guiding figure Soo-chan claimed to have seen were the soul of this kind-hearted child, who was protecting his companions in his final moments. The grandmother's son had also been seriously injured in the sinkhole. The underground water had already flooded to the second floor, and the muddy current kept rising. Dongwon urged the elderly woman to leave with them. But having lost her loved ones, she had fallen into despair. She stared blankly at the collapsed ruins and ultimately chose to stay there, quietly keeping her son company. Helpless, Dongwon carried Soo-chan on his back and moved forward with difficulty, groping his way up to the outside of the third floor. Before them remained only a narrow pipe. They had to pass through here to continue up to the fourth floor. Under the oppression of darkness and the sound of water, Dongwon shouted desperately, finally attracting the response of Sung-hyun and others above. Everyone worked together to pull the father and son up. However, the danger was far from over. The flood caused by the heavy rain quickly rose to the roof, and the trapped people were now truly sitting ducks. Even more terrifying was that there was a teetering building above their heads, which could fall at any time and bury them completely in the abyss. Just in this desperate moment, Yunju suddenly saw a water bucket floating by. This discovery gave her a flash of inspiration. If they could collect enough floating objects, perhaps they could make a makeshift life-saving device to fight for a chance of survival in the flood. While everyone was looking around, a huge water storage tank floated over. This was simply a God-sent submarine. They immediately crawled into the tank, entering the narrow space one by one. When it was Mansu's turn, he stopped because someone had to stay outside to close the lid. He chose to be the one to sacrifice himself. Before everyone could react, Mansu slammed the lid tight. Water from all directions instantly poured into the sinkhole, and the falling building crashed down with it. The huge impact slapped the water tank directly into the deeper parts. The survivors inside the tank felt unprecedented fear and despair. Under the massive buoyancy, the water tank began to rise rapidly, but it got entangled by cables during the ascent. Dongwon and the others jumped and rocked desperately inside to give the tank more inertia, finally breaking free from the cables. However, before they could celebrate, the tank was pierced and stuck by an exposed steel pipe, and a large amount of water poured in madly. Fortunately, at the critical moment, Mansu appeared again. Using all his strength, he kicked fiercely again and again, finally kicking the tank free. But the tank was left with a huge hole. If not plugged in time, the whole tank would sooner or later fill with water. Seung-hyun made an admirable decision. He used his own fist to plug the hole, using his flesh and blood to win a chance of survival for his companions. Although Mansu was exhausted and his body began to sink, luckily a cable tangled around his leg, dragging him up to the surface along with the buoyancy of the water tank. When the water tank finally surfaced, Mansu used his last bit of strength to open the lid, and the 6 people finally saw the light of day again. The rescue team arrived in time and pulled them up to the ground one by one. This thrilling underground survival story finally came to a close, but the impression it left on every survivor was unforgettable for a lifetime. Months passed, the sinkhole was completely filled, and Jiangsu-dong returned to its former calm. Life seemingly returned to normal on the surface, but for those who had experienced the test of life and death, everything was completely different. One day, Seung-hyun invited Dongwon and Mansu to a gathering. As they walked, they wondered how there could be a house in such a place. Just as they were discussing, Seung-hyun came up with a smile. It turned out he didn't buy a fixed apartment but chose an RV as his new home. Seung-hyun proudly introduced his new home, a house that could go anywhere. Today he could see the view of the Han River, tomorrow the scenery of Namsan, and on weekends he could go to the beach for a vacation. Walking inside the RV, although the space was small, it was warm and comfortable, complete with a bed, refrigerator, and stove. Dongwon still didn't quite understand. In his concept, a house should be a place where you live in a fixed location for 10 or 20 years to be considered a real home. But Seung-hyun had adopted a completely different attitude towards life. He didn't want to wait another 10 years to start being happy, but wanted to enjoy life starting today. As night fell, the lights in the RV by the Han River shone brightly, and laughter echoed in the night sky. The people who once supported each other deep underground were now sitting together, sharing simple and precious happiness. They finally understood the true meaning of life. A real home doesn't depend on how big or expensive the house is, but on who you are with. True happiness doesn't need to be waited for bitterly. It is hidden in every moment of the present.